welcome to this HKM live session on Israeli settler colonialism, its roots, the collusion of Israel and all the forces, the liberal states across North America and Europe, and also, of course, the continued resistance of Palestinians. My name is Bilal Zahoor. I'm the member of Haqooq-e-Khalq Movement and also an editor of Folio Books, a Lahore-based independent publishing house. It's been a painful 2 weeks for Palestinians, unfolding mayhem and devastation across the occupied Palestine. We have seen Israeli forces attacking worshippers at Al-Aqsa, dragging protesters across the streets, and causing all kinds of mayhem, including the raids to Palestinian homes in Jarrah, in Sheikh Jarrah and elsewhere. This ongoing brutality, rightly called Nakba by Palestinian activists, is absolutely nothing but just another demonstration of systemic ethnic displacement of Palestinians, this time around in Sheikh Jarrah, a Muslim Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem. The Israeli forces, the state of Israel, tried to portray it as a local land dispute to be settled by the courts. But as we know, the occupation Supreme Court has already favored the right-wing settler organizations in its earlier verdict. The proceedings are highly likely to culminate in legalizing these settler colonial efforts in Sheikh Jarrah, eventually, unfortunately, displacing hundreds of Palestinians from their homes. So this effort, this particular episode of settler colonialism in a long, rich series of settler colonialism is actually what drove the protests in Jerusalem. So we at HKM are doing this session today to communicate that Israel is an apartheid state, continuously seeking the ethnic displacement of Palestinians. We are also very much aware of the Israeli designs of using the horrors of Holocaust as an excuse, as an instrument of silencing the world of its atrocities in occupied Palestine. This and I think in relation to this particular diabolical excuse that Israeli state continues to use needs to be shattered and busted in order to unveil the true horrific, brutal face of a state, of an apartheid state that's been in action for decades. I'll pass on to my co-host, Tabitha Spence, a member of Haqooq-e-Khalq Movement and a climate activist, to introduce the speakers. And from there on, we'll move on and shed light on the past, present, and the future of the settler colonial efforts and also the consequent resistance of Palestinians. Over to you, Tabitha.
Tabby seems not to be able to unmute herself.
All right, thanks a lot, Bilal. Welcome to the speakers, welcome to the viewers of the Haqooq-e-Khalq Movement. I'd like to thank everyone for taking out the time to have this conversation. We've seen that this is a critical moment of rapidly developing situations across Gaza and the West Bank. And what we've also seen is in the streets of cities around the world, massive protests are underway, people are coming out. And so we organized a protest here in Lahore, and we've been watching what's been happening in the streets. We saw over 100,000 people in London yesterday. And so we are having this conversation to both understand the history of the crisis, of the occupation in Israel, and also to think about what the progressive left, what the international movement for solidarity and justice can do moving forward as the bombs continue to fall in Gaza, as people continue to stand up, as children and families continue to be murdered. So with that, as Bilal said, my name is Tabitha. You can call me Tabby. I am involved with HKM. Clearly, I'm not from Pakistan. I'm an American myself. And I feel like it is my responsibility to emphasize the role that the United States has played in backing this entire operation for many decades, with billions of dollars in funds supporting this every single year, with weapons, with training, and with its obstructive role at the international level to prevent any kind of sanctions or actions against this occupying regime. So I just want to very briefly say this doublespeak that we hear in the US and that its a PR machine around the world advances, it seems so senseless that Israel could possibly be claiming that it's defending itself right now while dropping bombs from the sky and having one of the most powerful militaries in the world against a few rockets, against people who are just peacefully trying to live their lives. And I think that the veil is fall when it comes to people actually believing that doublespeak. And as a person who grew up hearing it, I didn't have any exposure to the truth until I was a teenager and I heard a Palestinian man speaking at a peace group about the actual conditions in Gaza and the West Bank. But I think a lot of people haven't had that opportunity. But now what we see with people coming into the streets with social media, etc., you know, it's clear what's actually happening. So I'd like to just thank our panelists for helping us contextualize what's happening, for speaking to us also directly from Jerusalem to help us understand the scenes in the streets right now, and for helping us think about, particularly here in Pakistan, what we can do to advance the cause for solidarity and justice. And with that, I'd like to introduce our guests. The first really needs no introduction. Tariq Ali is with us, and he is a prominent British Pakistani activist and author based in the UK. He's also the editor of the New Left Review. And he also came from the demonstration in London, so we'll be able to speak to that. Our second guest is Toufic Haddad, who is a Palestinian academic, and he is the author of a book called Palestine Limited, Neoliberalism and Nationalism in the Occupied Territories, which was published in 2016. He completed his PhD at SOAS in London in 2015 and has been working in various capacities as a journalist and researcher. And he currently lives in Sheikh Jarrah of East Jerusalem. So he will be speaking to us about the dispossession that's underway there. Our third speaker is Dana Al-Kurd, and she is a researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. She's also an assistant professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. And last but not least, we have with us Farooq Sulehria, who's an assistant professor at Beacon House National University here in Lahore. He's also the editor of the Jaddu-Jahad Daily. So with that, I'd like to invite Tariq Ali to speak to us about the context and the history of this occupation. Thank you so much, Tariq, for being with us today.
Very happy to be with all of you in these grim times. It's good to report that yesterday's solidarity with the Palestinian people enveloped the globe. In London, we had 100,000 people. The crowds were so thick that I literally couldn't get to the platform to speak, which was a wonderful feeling because none of us thought the turnout would be so huge. Huge demonstration in Baghdad, almost 100,000 people, big demonstrations in Sydney, Chicago we had the week before, in the United States. So the narrative is being altered by the solidarity demonstrations. No one believes the official media, neither the CNN nor the BBC, who are effectively pro-government propaganda organizations and seen as such. People tend not to believe them. Now, the question is this, which hasn't been posed in the mainstream media at all. Why is Israel doing this? I mean, let's not dignify the media and Israeli propaganda by even accepting for a minute the premise on which they claim they're doing this. It was a straightforward, clear act of provocation by the Israeli Defense Forces, by the Israeli government. The symbiosis between the two is very clear. It always has been there. Israel has been a military political enterprise right from the beginning, and that hasn't changed. And why did they decide to do it at this point in time? I think to make it clear, both to the Palestinians in the occupied territories and the Israeli Palestinians, who are Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, that they're not going to take any more nonsense and that they're going to do what they want. They want to ethnically cleanse Jerusalem of all Palestinians and make it, in my opinion, if they can get away with it, 100% Jewish city, which marks a total break with what Jerusalem has been now for several centuries. So that is the aim. And once they've cleansed Jerusalem, they will then slowly start driving Palestinians in the occupied territories, already living in miserable conditions, out of historic Palestine. So what we are seeing is an act of political extermination of the Palestinian entity, and at the same time, a forced pushing out, cleansing. It is a new Nakba. It's a slow Nakba, not as quick as the one which took place in 1948 when they raped, killed, tortured, destroyed villages, as we all know now. There's no big secret about it. What we are now witnessing is a slow Nakba. The aim basically is to grab all of historic Palestine, and there are two prongs to this. One is what they're doing, to try and demoralize, to try and make it clear to the Palestinian, no one in the world is defending them, they can't fight. Every time they try it, they suffer a political moral defeat, if not a military one. And they're trying that again. They tried it with the Intifada. They tried it with the second Intifada. Remember Sharon going and doing exactly the same thing in Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. And now Netanyahu has done it for the third time. So on the Israeli side, we're witnessing a further push on their attempt to exterminate Palestine. And from the Palestinian side, I think we are at the beginning of what could become a third Intifada. That is the situation. There is no way out of it. And so I am one of those people who defends all forms of struggle against this Israeli dictatorial apartheid regime. I defend the right of BDS to boycott, divest, and sanction them, a non-violent way, which they don't like, in carrying it out as anti-Semite. And I support the right of the Palestinian people and their organizations to defend themselves by the use of force. I defend it, it is their right. No other colonized peoples has been denied their right, except at the time when the fighting was taking place. They have a right to do it. So No nonsense on that. How will it proceed? Judging from the past, there will be some noises made in official circles, though this time there have been fewer than before. Some homilies, some double standards used, and the desire will be to calm things down. But if Egypt is used to calm down Hamas and the United States tells the Israelis enough for now, what will happen in 5 years' time? What we are facing is a real colonial problem. The notion that Israel is under threat from anyone is a joke. They've got nuclear weapons and they're the one power in the world quite capable of using them if they feel so obliged. So no one is threatening them. What we are demanding is that, or some of us are demanding, is that having failed to create or allow or permit the establishment of an independent Palestine, which, to be frank, was never on the cards. Oslo made that pretty clear, despite all the nonsense, that what is going to happen. Here, the Israelis have had a position for a very long time. Sometimes said in public, but often spoken in private. When asked what will happen to the Palestinians, they say it's not our responsibility. It's the responsibility of all the Arab states in the region. And they say it. After all, we're the only Jewish state. There are lots of Arab states. Why don't they take small chunks of Palestinians into their countries? That is the way of thinking. And that is their ultimate aim. They won't succeed, I hope, but that is their ultimate aim, to use the semi-colonial status of the Arab world today and force them to accept Palestinian refugees. This must be resisted, and I'm sure will be resisted by the citizens of the Arab states who do not agree with what their governments are doing. I mean, the fact that Egypt and Turkey still recognize Israel after 2 attacks on Gaza, after the 2 intifadas, why? Because they're under heavy US pressure to do so. The Egyptian state is on the payroll of the United States, and Turkey plays its own games and is a member of NATO. No attempt, apart from demagogy, in sending a few boatloads on the part of Turkey with food, a drop in the ocean. So the Israeli aim of isolating the Palestinians from Arab states is successful on the level of state power. It is not successful on the level of the populations of these countries, as we saw in the huge demonstration in Baghdad, and I hope we will see huge demonstrations in Cairo and Algiers before too long. This has been a big success for the Israelis backed by the Americans. I don't know when we'll see huge demonstrations in Pakistan, but those who constantly claim to speak in the name of Islam don't actually defend the real needs of Muslim peoples, as in Palestine, when it comes down to it. It's all demagogy, basically. So that is the situation we are in. What can we demand? I think the only reasonable demand is a single state solution in Israel. Two nationalities, one state, equal rights for everyone. Muslims, Jews, Christians, whoever else. That is the only long-term solution. You know, it is foolish to think that the Israelis can be driven into the sea, as some used to imagine wrongly in the 50s. I think we have 2 nation states here, whether we like it or not. And the question is, can they live in peace? The Palestinian leaders have made it clear that they are prepared to live in peace with the Israeli entity. It's the Israelis who have refused to do so constantly and consistently. This could be ended very quickly. This whole situation could be ended peacefully. How? if the United States and the European Union and Britain imposed immediate sanctions, cut off all aid, cut off all weapon supplies, and said that till the Israeli armies move out back to the 67 frontiers, nothing will happen. They've tried and nothing is moving forward. For that to happen, of course, you would need big changes in the political makeup of the United States, which is the key country, and which has effectively instructed the Israelis to do as they please. Congress and Senate have passed unanimous resolutions after 9/11, giving Israel a blank check in so many words. We will support everything that Israel does. And a handful of Congress members saying the opposite is a small step forward, but it's nowhere near what is needed. But that would stop the whole business. I mean, there is no way the Israeli population would be seriously split if the United States imposed sanctions, because they more or less see themselves as part of the United States. That is, I think, the only way forward. And in the meantime, I think all we can do, I mean, apart from what we do, is solidarity actions, support for BDS, big demonstrations when
Tariq sir, go on, please. Tariq sir, please go on.
I thought you was,
No, please go on.
I got a message from Tabby saying my time was up virtually, no?
No, that's fine. Please continue. We'll take some more time.
Did you, the rest of the stuff I said, did you hear it?
We heard you. Yeah, I think you were only muted for like 30 seconds.
Okay. So in terms of what needs to be done and what should be done is as follows. Those of us who have followed the Palestinian movement for a long, long time, and I would just like to recall that the person who really educated me on Palestine and what was happening, there were two people. The first was Ghassan Kanafani, the PFLP leader, poet, novelist, intellectual, a wonderful human being, at a conference in Kuwait in 1969 or 1970, a conference on Palestine. And the second was, of course, my friend Edward Said. And the third, Sulehria, was a whole bunch of Jewish Marxists who absolutely despised Zionism. So it was these three different inputs which made me think seriously about Israel and what it was and what it was becoming. And the late Isaac Deutscher warned them in his last recorded interview in 1967. He warned them that of an old Prussian saying in Germany, be careful, you can triumph yourself to death. And I think that is a lesson that the Israeli government and the Israeli military have not yet fully learned. When I've sometimes debated Israelis, either ex-military officers or politicians, the level of argument on the Likud politician who I once debated soon after 9/11 was so low that it was really embarrassing. and the military officer, Shimon Nave, who I debated in Barcelona 10, 15 years ago, was describing his talk at that conference in Barcelona on Palestine, was to describe how to destroy a Palestinian town. I'm not joking. And he said that in our group, there were serious discussions to avoid killing too many people, to go around the town and capture the hardcore elements, though it might take us more than a day or two, or go straight through the town, not care about how many people died or houses burnt, and take it. And he said we decided on the latter. We decided to do it in that particular way. So I said a bit like the Wehrmacht in Warsaw, how they destroyed the ghetto. And he said, let me correct you. It was not the Wehrmacht, it was the Waffen-SS. So they knew perfectly well how the Germans destroyed the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw. And they're not at all ashamed of being compared to it. The guy was brazen, completely unapologetic that they were more or less behaving in the same way and doing the same thing. And from Jerusalem, having provoked by attacking the mosque and driving out Palestinians from their old centuries-old localities, they then turned to Gaza. If there is any ghetto in the world today, it is Gaza. It is a Palestinian ghetto. And the latest information we have, it's that it's sealed off now from the outside world. Its communication lines cut off. Its buildings where there were elements of the media, Al Jazeera, AP, others, bombed, destroyed, so that no news can come out. So that all we see on the news is this manufactured garbage that is produced by the BBC and the American networks, and repeated, no doubt, in other parts of the world. And here we do have advantages that the big revolution in technology enables us now to, not on the same scale, obviously, but to show what is really going on. And that has been happening from people in Gaza, though that will be cut down since they've sealed all that off, and from Jerusalem, and from other places. And the questions we have to ask are this: what has happened to all the governments which go on and on and on about being Muslims, about defending Islam, etc.? The Indonesians, the Pakistanis, the Turks, the Arab states, what has happened to them? And the answer is very simple, that the wars waged by the United States on the Muslim world since 9/11, 20 years of war, have finally had their impact. Most of these governments are in the pockets of the United States, either politically or financially, and will not do anything that seriously offends the Americans. And the Americans are responsible for the green light given to the Israelis to do whatever they want. That is the grim side of today's world. There is not even an effort made to respect international law, to say that the Israeli politicians should be charged with war crimes, though that, when that started off, the court was put under huge pressure, and we'll see finally what happens. And of course, Netanyahu and his gangsters immediately denounced this very tiny, moderate attempt to charge Israel with war crimes. They said that this is a sign of anti-Semitism. So the old arguments they've been using, if you're a non-Jew and you give solidarity to the Palestinian, you're anti-Semites. If you're a Jew and you support the Palestinians, you're a self-hating Jew. I mean, to call some of the Orthodox Jews who've been demonstrating in the United States, London, and other cities, and trampling the Zionist flag under their feet while holding up a Palestinian flag, that has happened. Orthodox Jews have done it. To call them anti-Semitic or self-hating Jews, that doesn't wash. That doesn't wash. So, but the opposition in Israel has virtually disappeared. Tiny demonstrations, nice ones, but tiny in terms of the rest of the population, of anti-government Jews and Palestinians and anti-Zionists getting together. But you look at them, 200 people here, 100 people there, etc. The old opposition, the peace movement that was much stronger, no longer exists in Israel. The fight in Israeli elections is between one far-right faction against another far-right faction. And the sad thing is that some think that the main problem is Netanyahu. If we get rid of Netanyahu, it'll be fine. Look, there have been better people than Netanyahu in the Israeli government. From 1948, they used to even call themselves socialists. Ben Gurion, Golda Meir, Moshe Sharat. And Moshe Sharat, who was considered himself to be a left-wing social democrat, who defended the expulsion of the Palestinians and said in one of his statements, he said, yeah, I do feel a bit sorry for the Palestinians. It's true, but we have to kick them out. And I wonder what will happen to them, he said. They will probably end up in poverty-stricken ghettos in Arab cities. Well, actually, they ended up in camps. And I visited these camps after the Six-Day War in 1967, photographed the conditions, spoke to the survivors, and it was a heartrending story, completely heartrending. And that goes on and on and on and on, and the world watches. And when we tell them, why do you blame the Palestinians? Why are the Palestinian Arabs blamed? They are the indirect victims of the Judeocide of the Second World War. Because had that event for which Europeans are responsible not taken place, there would have been the state of Israel as we know it certainly wouldn't have existed. They don't like this argument because we're all part of the same Judeo-Christian civilization. Well, to be honest, if they were telling the truth, the only civilization in the past that has defended the Jews and brought them up to very high positions was Islamic civilization. In the court of Saladin in Cairo, most of his advisors were Jews, which wasn't odd at all. In Muslim Spain and Muslim Portugal, Jewish people rose to very high levels of government and authority, which they haven't ever had before or since in the European world where they were. So what is this Judeo-Christian civilization? It's the so-called Christian civilization, which is responsible for the millions of Jews who were killed, executed, burned, gassed during the Second World War. And why didn't the West then, fighting a war against the government doing this, spend a day or two sending special bomber planes to destroy the concentration camps? Why didn't they do it? No one stopped them. The Jewish agency actually said, please do it. It doesn't matter if some Jews are killed, at least these monstrous extermination camps will be destroyed. They didn't do it. The reason they didn't do it, one reason, was that they feared that the existing anti-Semitism in the United States, Britain, and France, amongst ordinary people, would not buy it. It wouldn't be easy to justify. The only country which organized the Jewish population in Jewish resistant groups who fought both inside the Red Army and independently of the Red Army was in the Soviet Union, which basically won that war. Wasn't won by France, which was a collaborationist power, and which just yesterday refused to allow a demonstration in Paris to take place. So in this world, a lot is unpredictable, and we don't know exactly what will happen. But I think, and I have said this, and they now don't speak to me, some of the PLO leaders are to blame for this. They have not yet publicly denounced Oslo as a maneuver that it was to try and basically crush the Palestinians. Well, they got caught up in the rhetoric. When people speak of a Palestinian Authority, there is no Palestinian Authority. There is the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, whose orders are carried out by the so-called Palestinian Authority and its security forces. And everyone knows that. It's not hidden. So the most encouraging thing about the third Intifada, as I choose to call it, the most encouraging thing here is a new generation has come up. The second generation, the previous generation, which created the last Intifadas, was ignored. The minute the first Intifada took place, the Israelis realized they had to do something. They refused to negotiate with the leadership of the Intifada in Israel and the occupied territories and rushed to Tunis because they thought they could do a deal with the PLO, and they were right. They got a very good deal from the PLO. Collapse of the resistance, collaboration. PLO secret police forces boasting of how close they were to the Israelis, loving the fact that they were being taken seriously. And for what? I'm not dogmatic. If that had led to any real changes, we would have said, okay, we were wrong, you were right. Now, Edward Said said from the very beginning, the Oslo Accords are a total defeat. They're a Palestinian Versailles. A Treaty of Versailles imposed on half of Europe after the First World War. And we don't like to say it. We were proved right.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the intervention, but we'll hopefully come back to you on the second round if we have some time left. Let's now go to Sheikh Jarrah and listen from Toufic. Toufic, you are in Sheikh Jarrah at the moment, the epicenter of the ongoing displacement designs. Could you please let us know briefly what's happening in the neighborhood? Also, if you could comment on the organizing on the ground at the moment and the larger picture of the Palestinian resistance movement.
Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you for having me here today. So I live in Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood that's right at the beginning of sort of heading north from the old city towards north, basically. But basically for the last, the attempt to ethnically cleanse Sheikh Jarrah is not new. There's been long-going efforts, actually. There is already several settlement outposts in the neighborhood. We're talking about 150 meters from where I'm giving this Zoom conversation. The most latest round of it had to do with the failure of 4 families who had more or less exhausted their legal appeals. But there are 8 families on this side of the road and another 20 families on the other side of the road that are also trying to fight legally to prevent eviction. The Israelis, what they're trying to do through these efforts are basically create a west to east corridor that will cut off the inner, what they call the Holy Basin, the area which has the majority of the religious sites in it, from its natural East Jerusalem Arab periphery, so to speak. And this would be basically the inner circle of 3 separate concentric circles that surround East Jerusalem, and thereby ghettoizing the population inside of it. Now, of course, this is an egregious example of sort of ethnic cleansing. The houses in which they're trying to take over were built by the United Nations in 1954 and 1956 in an agreement with the Jordanian government to try and to settle Palestinian refugees from West Jerusalem as well as from other parts of historical Palestine in this area. So, but Israel, as it's typically done in other circumstances, sort of has its eye in this neighborhood because of strategic relevance. The settlement activity here would link up with different parts of Wadi Joz and Silwan planned activity. Very similar to what Tariq says, it's part of, you know, sort of a long-standing sort of another dunam, another goat, sort of the day-by-day expansion of what's possible through the legal apparatus and mechanism of the Israeli state, which de facto attempts to and overtly tries to Judaize the area, basically. So obviously there's been a big pushback. It hasn't been anything new, but there was an interesting confluence of different factors that came together that led to the pushback. There had been a small core of people who were dedicated to this struggle. So basically, when things started heating up in the last 30, 40 days, we started witnessing demonstrations. The Israelis started being more forceful with their activity. The demonstrators also became quite creative in how they did things. As Tariq mentioned, there's also there are a couple of families that were subject for eviction that were able to speak English very well, to be frank, and it made a big difference. I mean, Muna al-Kurdi has 500,000 followers on Twitter, and her and her brother, who are in many senses leading sort of the struggle on the ground, have been able to get a lot of attention because of that. At the same time, the Israelis were just sort of in their arrogance, to be frank, you know, in Damascus Gate area, which is about 1.5 kilometers from here, they took a very just sort of punitive step just to try, when Ramadan began, to try and stop Palestinians from sitting on Damascus Gate. Like, I mean, one of the main things Palestinians wanted to do during Ramadan is they want to go down to the old city and get, you know, with their families and enjoy the lights and go to Al-Aqsa and enjoy the nice weather, the spring weather. I mean, everybody's been stuck under COVID and is fed up. So this step sort of was very much of a strong provocation, and it led to a strong fight back. At the same time, you had a kind of the Israelis for the last 20 years have very much unleashed a very strong Judeo-supremacist zeitgeist under Netanyahu that's been able to operate without any kinds of constraints. I mean, the entire political sphere in Israel is sort of, it's very normal to speak in openly racist terms. And actually, the debate inside Israel is who's going to lead the Israeli right wing, not whether it's between the left or the right, or the left and the center, or the right and the center, or whatnot. It's who leads the right. And Netanyahu is the most adept at that, actually. And he formed a coalition of some pretty scary characters around this. So, and in fact, those characters were both coming to Damascus Gate and Al-Aqsa and the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood as forms of provocation to make show their stand and be on the ground there. So this is really what ignited the situation here. For the last 40 days, we haven't really slept here in Sheikh Jarrah. Demonstrations happen daily. We're talking about mounted police, rubber bullets, beatings. The settlers now, if you've seen, have started to use live ammunition. The streets of Jerusalem stink from the stink water that is, they just spray with abandon around the neighborhood. But there's a strong sense of defiance that's going on in the neighborhood. And actually, there's an interesting dimension here because, like, they realized elements of the strategic class of the Israeli state, the army and the Shin Bet, realized that during Ramadan, and particularly in the incident of the attempt to host the Jerusalem United rally, that this was going to actually have the potential to really ignite a powder keg, not just locally, but potentially beyond. So the Attorney General stepped in and he actually delayed the ruling on the evictions for a month. And then they actually stopped the right-wing demonstrators to go to Al-Aqsa. Then they stopped them to go through Damascus Gate and then the rockets came that day and actually stopped the actual demonstration itself. There's actually interesting kind of internal disunity between different parts of the Israeli elite about how best to manage the situation. On the Palestinian side, there's a feeling that Jerusalem is a winning card, in the sense that Palestinians are not here in Jerusalem, are not accountable to the Israelis. They're not citizens. They get poor services. They're abused by the cops. They're fined for everything. They're not allowed to build anything. And the Palestinian Authority has no authority over them here either. So you very much have the elements that are very similar and akin to the first Intifada existing in Jerusalem. The Oslo paradigm changed the situation for Palestinians in West Bank major cities and in Gaza, where you were able to create forms of Palestinian self-governance there that kind of created buffers between the local population and the Israelis, because elements of civil services were taken over by the Palestinians, and also the Israelis wanted this because they wanted to sandwich the Palestinian cause and not give real rights, but force any governing body to basically have to decide between its own existence and its political rights. So by using the stick and the carrot, became this very effective measure. But in Jerusalem, that's not the case. Jerusalem is open exposure to the Israeli occupation, and Palestinians here have a very strong Jerusalem identity and feel themselves as protectors of their city. The case of Sheikh Jarrah relates to literally hundreds of thousands of other Palestinians in Jerusalem, who 100,000 Palestinians live in houses that do not have official building permits. It means that they can be kicked out too. There's a lot of settlement activity in Wadi Joz, in Silwan, and around other parts of Jerusalem that also would have precedential implications if the evictions of Sheikh Jarrah happen. So there's very much a feeling of nothing to lose here. Now, of course, the case of Jerusalem is one particularity, one case study of what apartheid Israel is today. We have other case studies, and it looks different. The colonial architecture of Israeli apartheid in control looks different naturally across different parts of historical Palestine, because their colonial project did not succeed in one wave. It started to 48 and then 67, and then you have Oslo, and you have different forms of control, different measures of control being used, different levels of rights that Palestinians have, some more heavy with the stick like Gaza, others more bureaucratic but always with the stick in hand behind the curtain, so to speak, such as the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So I think this is important for the audience to realize that we have a new map that has been created across historical Palestine, dominated by one Israeli apartheid regime that has an ongoing settler colonial identity and project to it. It controls and enforces its rule through different means across different areas, but the ultimate aim is the same: Jewish supremacy, fragment the Palestinians, eventually evict them if possible, turn them into human dust, and get rid of them. Of course, no question, no talking about what goes on outside. So when we see the resistance, an issue like Jerusalem that can ignite the entirety of this Palestinian, because every Palestinian can relate to this colonial domination, it expresses itself and along the lines, the fault lines and the modes of struggle that each of these contexts had previously going, you see. And we are witnessing now, basically, I mean, the Oslo Accords was trying to solve and liquidate the Palestinian cause in total, primarily focusing on Palestinians in the OPT, but actually it had grave implications on Palestinians in 48. So the point, and obviously Jerusalem. So you have everybody able to relate to this, strong, and Jerusalem is central to Palestinian national cause and rights anyway. So strong elements of solidarity, strong demonstrations. Israel taking its measures as it is in each of these locations, because it's also constrained in different ways. But you have interesting elements now of where, because of this zeitgeist that I mentioned, this sort of Judeo-fascistic, unhinged, supremacist, ideological, political, military dimensions, it is a very dangerous situation that is unfolding here. We see that obviously in the bombs that are falling on Gaza, but we also see it in the kinds of pogroms that are taking place in 1948 Palestinians, the open, the way settler groups are not just coming to Jerusalem and attacking and shooting in my neighborhood here, but are also going to Lid against Palestinian citizens of Israel and are with the police. I mean, yesterday I put a post on Facebook of the demonstrations in Lid, who are Palestinian citizens of Israel, got much bigger and out of control after a settler shot a Palestinian who was demonstrating there. And he did it behind the lines. There were Israeli police behind him. He had an Israeli flag in one hand and he had the gun in the other. The Israeli police had the picture of this fellow. I mean, and they said he's released from jail. And they said he acted in self-defense, even though he's, with all self-assurance, committed the crime, while hundreds of Palestinians are being arrested in their homes and beaten by the cops, and they're technically citizens of the state of Israel. So, I mean, I don't need to go too much on. What we're seeing is the complete collapse of the conflict management scenario that the international community has been dealing with the situation. They abandoned political solutions a long time ago, but they thought that they could pull out of their pocket money and buy people off here and there, and through these divisions and the different carrot and stick methods, they could control the situation, and that they could buy people off and divide them more and more and more. And it's not working. In fact, it's the opposite. Like, more and more Palestinians see common cause across the spectrum. I mean, they always knew it, but now there's more common fight back. And you see Palestinians from 1948 area coming to Jerusalem. They are the main peoples who are fighting in Jerusalem, both in Al-Aqsa as well in places like Sheikh Jarrah. You also see what Tariq says, a new generation of strugglers who grew up post-Oslo in their consciousness, also fighting, because injustice is tethered, of one generation becomes tethered to another, and it's impossible to say. It's not that you just see who is above you and who is below you. It's a common situation. It's very relatable across the spectrum of all Palestinian communities, that we have one enemy here, which is both apartheid Israel, but also the complicity of the Western governments and the false models and peace process and buzzwords that they use to try and contain the situation. So that's how we need to be organizing our struggle, I would argue, and framing it, to be frank. So that's probably good.
Thank you so much, Toufic, for taking out the time, especially there. I know the situation is very hard, to speak to us and share with us what you're seeing and the general situation. I did want to kind of, relate what you've been saying about the forms of intervention to our next speaker, Dana Kurd, who's a researcher in Doha. And her work is predominantly on international involvement within the Arab world. In addition to that, of course, we've seen major interventions by, we just saw Trump's administration move the US Embassy to Jerusalem. And so I'd like to invite Dana to talk to us a bit about how this international intervention has impacted the conditions of Palestinians today. If Dana, you can join us now.
Yes, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure. So I just want to kind of give a quick introduction about myself. I'm Palestinian from Jerusalem. The impacts of Oslo I kind of saw growing up as Jerusalem changed. First when I was living there, and then after I moved to the US, I would go and visit my family regularly, and you know, around us a settlement was built, and our family was not very far from Sheikh Jarrah. We lived in Shafat and Beit Hanina, and you know, we saw Pescat Saif being built. I saw it, you know, growing up. And then Muhammad Abu Khdair, if anybody remembers, in 2014 was brutally murdered in our neighborhood. And these are the kinds of kind of formative moments in my upbringing that made me really want to focus on the issue of, you know, self-determination in the Arab world and how international intervention impacts these struggles. And so today I will be using the research I conducted for my first book to give a background on how international and particularly American intervention has sort of set up the situation we see today in historic Palestine, and particularly in the Palestinian territories, and how Palestinians, in spite of that, overcame some of this, you know, deliberate fragmentation in the recent events we saw. So I'll argue that international intervention has not only been used to deny Palestinians self-determination, but has also impacted the relationship between the Palestinian public and its leadership, as well as, you know, to some degree, effectively demobilize Palestinians, as Toufic was mentioning, so that they can resist the Israeli occupation less effectively. And in my research, as I said, I focus on the U.S. specifically, so I'll be, you know, focusing on that in this discussion. But I do touch upon other international donors and powers as well. So let me just open up here my notes. Sorry. So the three types of international intervention that I'll be discussing today, kind of in the time period after Oslo specifically, are diplomatic pressure, foreign aid, and then military and security involvement. So on the point, you know, beginning with diplomatic pressure, I think the 2006 elections are a really good case in point, the 2006 Palestinian elections, on how this kind of pressure works. So we saw that, you know, there was a WikiLeaks dump called the Palestine Papers, which showed that the UK and the US had been pressuring the Palestinian Authority to repress Hamas, the Islamist party, prior to any elections had even taken place. But then when Hamas did actually win elections in 2006, in a free and fair election by all accounts, there was international backing and support and even pressure on the Palestinian Authority to repress the Islamists and prevent them from taking power. And the international community, to do so, lined up behind the American position on this and imposed sanctions on the Palestinians, which at the time decimated their economy. There were aid mechanisms set up which were supposed to help people kind of keep afloat and bypass the new Hamas government, but they went into personal accounts of government officials, including President Mahmoud Abbas. And so all of this led to a severe and rapid decline in democratic accountability within the Palestinian political system, not only because aid was dispersed without transparency and that the outgoing political party Fatah was empowered to remain in control of the government, but it also because of the signal it sent to Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian public about what it would mean for them to exercise political agency. And so there was a crackdown on the Islamist groups, and this led to intra-Palestinian fighting between the different political parties, as well as repression of groups in both parts of the territories, the West Bank and Gaza, and a split in governance that we see persists to this day. So in Gaza, we have the Hamas government, and in the West Bank, we have the Palestinian Authority, which is dominated by Fatah, the political party. So the second mechanism of international intervention I look at in my book is the use of foreign aid in a very targeted way. So following the elections I just talked about, Fatah retook control of the Palestinian Authority and consolidated their control over the West Bank specifically because they had lost control of Gaza. And then the new Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad, pursued a strategy of quote unquote liberation through reform. The idea being that if you improve living conditions incrementally, then eventually this would lead to a state. And he especially wanted he argued that the PA should be more involved in decisions related to development goals, setting 3-year plans and things like this, but truthfully, decision-making was never in their hands. The Palestinian Authority was essentially relegated to the role of small-scale implementation of these development projects that were set by international donors, particularly green-lighted by the Americans. So one example of this kind of lack of agency is there are two development agencies that monitor and manage foreign aid in the Palestinian territories. There's the Joint Liaison Committee and then the Task Force on Project Implementation. Israel has a seat in both, and the Palestinian Authority has a seat on neither. And so even though there was an increase in foreign aid at this time from 2006 until recently, it went to very specific domain areas that didn't help conditions in the territories because the Palestinian Authority wasn't necessarily involved in the decision making, but also because the point of this aid was to kind of put a band-aid. It was to stabilize and make sure that no uprisings like the Second Intifada could occur again. Nobody, from their perspective untoward could come to political power. So at that time, only 1% of this aid was allocated to agriculture, for example, despite being historically the backbone of the Palestinian economy, and 30% went to expanding the security sector. And the share of manufacturing and total value added shrank from 20 to 11% of GDP between 1994 and 2018, specifically. So essentially, none of the aid and development plans addressed Israel's obstructionist role in any way to the Palestinian economy. And it essentially perpetuated the status quo, didn't achieve the objectives of the PA in terms of improving living conditions or building a state, which is what they're always, their stated intentions always have been, or, even exercising some level of decision making. Professor Manal Jamal's work in her recent book, Promoting Democracy, also shows how since the creation of the Palestinian Authority, how aid to Palestine has been very lopsided, with an oversized allocation to things like security and also these democracy promotion programs, and less of a de-emphasis on local politics and local initiatives, which are key to building Palestinian organizing capacity. Whereas she shows in her book, other states also deemed, post-conflict around the same time, in the early 1990s. So she uses the case of El Salvador specifically, have the opposite. So there's more allocation to local programs, less the one-size-fits-all democracy promotion, which is indeed not truly promotion, but rather a stabilization of the status quo. And this was confirmed to me, in particular, when I spoke to many decision makers in my interviews and in my fieldwork, working within a number of ministries, particularly the coercive apparatus, like the preventative security and these kinds of organizations. So, they all told me that American objectives and directives, like from their understanding, are the standard. That even though there are a number of donors, there's the EU, there's Gulf countries, there's Japan, there's a number of donors that might give aid to the Palestinian Authority, that they all coordinated and complied with the American standard and facilitated American objectives. And many of them complained that this money was often used in ways that were considered non-priorities and seemed counterproductive, like they weren't addressing the needs of what people needed, what people were struggling with. And another way that the donors intervened in kind of the day-to-day political decision-making was involvement in the funding of training for Palestinian Authority officials and decision makers and bureaucrats. So career advancement for many of them have to do with these trainings that they attend. And when the Americans fund training, they would get involved in deciding who could be included on these trainings. They would exclude anyone who had political beliefs that weren't aligned with the American line, essentially. Palestinian Authority officials also complained that American donors sometimes were trying to indoctrinate them. For example, they mentioned like the syllabi or like the agendas of training programs for the officials. This particular example was from the Ministry of Interior, were amended by American officials if they included discussions of the Israeli occupation or popular mobilization. And finally, according to the people I interviewed, the Americans got involved in the decision-making of particularly key ministries, in terms of decision-making related to political repression, by forcing critical bureaucrats into early retirement. So if somebody didn't, agree with the goings-on, they'd find themselves out of a job. So overall, this aid, I focused on a few key examples, but generally speaking, the aid has not improved either political decision-making or economic conditions. The economy is in crisis. Palestinians are heavily in debt on an individual level. Real GDP per capita is in decline. In 2008, it was the same level as it was in 1999. And there are Israeli deductions from revenue that they collect taxes, they deduct a certain amount, and they never return it to the Palestinian Authority. It's often, for political reasons. And so this has led to conditions of aid dependence. Large segments of the Palestinian society also work directly for the Palestinian Authority, dependent on aid. And even independent segments, like we see, for example, in civil society, that's also been crowded out by foreign aid. There's a general sense that, people are not able to solve problems holistically that are facing Palestinian society. And finally, the third type of international intervention I looked at was security involvement. So as I mentioned earlier, after the elections, the Palestinian Authority was encouraged to undertake security sector reform to assure their Israeli counterparts that the Palestinian Authority and its security forces were a reliable partner. There would be no more intifadas, no more people getting elected that the Americans didn't like. And a lot of aid was allocated to the PA on this basis. At one point, they were spending a full third of their budget on the security apparatus. And it not only entailed a dramatic increase in policing and more coordination with Israel in terms of political repression, but it also entailed purging members on charges of corruption or political unreliability. So it changed the nature of who was involved in these. Even more so, they became more removed from the people that they were serving. So all of these kinds of mechanisms further divided the Palestinian Authority leadership from its citizens. The Palestinian Authority is seen more and more as a subcontractor of occupation. And in the context of, international involvement, the decision makers became less likely to care about public opinion or representing the public. When I asked them directly about this, they understandably, perhaps international intervention is at the forefront of their minds. They say, like, we know that the US employs a certain pro-democracy rhetoric, but their actions lie in a different camp. We fear the repercussions of being accountable. And international intervention also impacts public opinion and plays a kind of a divisive role on that level as well. In polling I conducted on this issue, I found that people who work with the PA have very different opinions from those who don't, on questions of accountability, on strategies for Palestinians, moving forward. These people that work for the PA cared much more about whether or not international powers would intervene. They were more worried about international consequences than the people who didn't work for the PA directly. So international intervention also is having this kind of divisive impact on public opinion and on strategies for moving forward. I didn't get into all of the ways in which, like, kind of the history of how the West Bank has been divided into areas A, B, and C, and all of these things. But suffice to say that there have not only been geographic, attempts at geographic fragmentation and geographic division, but there's, with the segregation wall, with all of these things, but there's also, a concerted effort to politically divide Palestinians. So as it relates to what we're seeing today, the Palestinian Authority, to Sheikh Jarrah and to some of these ongoing protests, first beginning in Jerusalem, reacting to what was happening at the Old City, reacting to what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah, joining forces with Palestinians within the Green Line. All of that, the Palestinian Authority was not a leader in any of this. It was essentially irrelevant to everything that happened. The protests that we saw, quote unquote, within Israel, none of them, they didn't organize, they didn't help facilitate any of these. And I'd argue Hamas was also quite irrelevant until the airstrike. Now there's a different story, but the protest movement that was happening was quite removed from political parties because, as Toufic said, Jerusalem is a very unique position where there's still direct clash, a direct Palestinians are directly facing the Israeli occupation, whereas in other places there are these buffers, there are these kinds of layers between them, and being able to effectively resist the Israeli occupation. Whereas in Jerusalem they are right there, and they're not beholden to any of these traditional power structures that have become quite overtaken by international intervention and concerns over that. All of this protest movement was quite grassroots. So the fact that, for example, President Biden called President Mahmoud Abbas was seen as laughable, on Palestinian social media. But with international intervention, we did see the Palestinian Authority actively stopping protests that come out in support of what is happening in Jerusalem at the beginning of this. So there was a protest in Hebron that was in Khalil that was shut down. There was also a similar protest in Ramallah or near Ramallah that was blocked by the Palestinian police forces to kind of play their role to make sure that things stayed calm on behalf of Israel and the international community. But that really upset people, and the Palestinian Authority is finding a lot of criticism for its role, a renewed criticism for its role, and it really highlights the separation between Palestinian political leadership and the Palestinian public that has been really an objective of I'd say the Oslo Accord paradigm overall. And the international community has also been, I'd say, essentially useless in hampering Israel's behavior or aggression in any way. Israel is seen as, obviously as a crucial part of U.S. security interests in the region, and the Trump administration's policies in the region was kind of the clearest face of that. And yes, we do see taboos being broken in the American political landscape, like, among certain members of Congress, within certain types of media coverage, but it doesn't really translate into any sort of radical shift in the near future as to how the US or its allies will respond to Israeli aggression. In fact, Biden has confirmed he's not much different on this issue from his predecessor. So the real impact on Israel will be from Palestinians on the ground, will be from how much they can pressure the Israeli state by keeping up pressure on various fronts, in Gaza, in the Green Line, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank. Now we're seeing even, on the borders, on the quote unquote borders of Israel, in Lebanon and Jordan, there are these protests that are amassing at the border. And next, the impact will come from people across the Arab world in particular, but I'd say the global South generally, who are resisting Palestine's occupation and both Palestinian the occupation of Palestine as well as authoritarianism in the same breath. So we saw protests happening even in Doha. We saw protests in Baghdad. We saw protests in Amman and Tunisia and Algiers and many cities, in spite of being blocked by the official authorities. That is where we see a challenge to the status quo, people power on the ground. And yeah, I'm open to any questions that you may have, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you very much, Dana, for the wonderful account of the foreign aid and the ramifications that come with it, and also the situation of ongoing resistance in Palestine and elsewhere. I'll now go to Farooq Sulehria. As Tabby mentioned in the introduction, he's a professor at Beacon House National University and also an editor of Jiddojahed Daily. Farooq, you have been associated with the left movement in Pakistan for a number of decades now, and all the support that's been coming from the left quarters to the Palestinian cause is really interesting, as has been documented by some of the poets and writers as well. So what would you like to say on that? And also please comment on the insistence of Pakistani liberals to recognize Israel, and perhaps a little bit of account on the pressure that the state has been lately experiencing coming from the Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so thank you everybody, and really an honor to be on this panel along with Tariq Ali Sahab, Toufic and Dana. In a while I will switch to Urdu and will be very brief. I won't take more than 3-4 minutes, so that the number of questions that are there addressed to Toufic and Dana and Tariq Sahab should be answered. And of course, they are much more informed on the question than myself. But before I switch to Urdu, just a small anecdote for Dana. Exactly when they were suspending aid for Hamas, they were giving a lot of aid to MMA, a coalition of fundamentalists who was ruling one of the provinces in Pakistan. And for last 5 decades almost, they have been funding all sort of terrorists and fundamentalists in Pakistan. I don't imply at all that Hamas is terrorist, but here in our country, they have been really funding the real terrorists. From Mujahideen to Taliban and everybody possible. मैं मुख्तसर सी 3 बातें करूंगा. पहली बात तो ये कि पाकिस्तान का बायां बाजू चाहे आपस में इख्तलाफात भी रखता हो, लेकिन फ़लस्तीन वो सवाल है, और भी बहुत से सवाल है, लेकिन फ़लस्तीन वो सवाल है जो लेफ्ट को पाकिस्तान में यूनाइट करता है। मैं एक छोटी सी मिसाल दूंगा, और ये एक लंबे अरसे की कमिटमेंट है लेफ्ट की फ़लस्तीन के साथ, जिसकी बेहतरीन अलामत ये है कि फैज़ अहमद फैज़ साहब ने जब अपनी नुस्ख़ा वफ़ा पब्लिश की तो उसका जो इंतसाब था वो यासर अराफात के नाम किया था। अभी बहुत से मौलवी हज़रात भी फ़लस्तीन की बात करते हैं, सिर्फ बात करते हैं, लेकिन एक दौर था जब जालिब अपनी नज़मों में मजाक उड़ाया करते थे मौलवियों का कि भाई कभी फ़लस्तीन की बात भी कर लिया करो, और तारिक अली साहब उसके विटनेस रहे हैं, तो वो शायद ज्यादा अगले सेशन में इस पे बेहतर बात कर सकेंगे। दूसरी बात मैं करना चाहता हूँ, जो पिछले 1-1.5 साल से जो फौज की पे में कुछ एंकर पर्सन है, उन्होंने एक प्रोपेगेंडा शुरू किया हुआ है कि इसराइल के साथ हमें ताल्लुकात बहाल कर लेने चाहिए। जब अरबों ने उनके साथ ताल्लुकात बहाल कर लिए हैं तो हम क्यों नहीं कर रहे? हम इस कैंपेन के शदीद खिलाफ है बतौर लेफ्ट। ये अरबों ने उनके साथ ताल्लुकात बहाल नहीं किए, ये अरब आमरों ने, आमरीतों ने, सुल्तानों ने, जो गैर जमहूरी है, जो साम्राज्य की मदद से जाबर हुक्मरान के तौर पर वहां मुसल्लत है, उन्होंने ताल्लुकात बहाल किए हैं। अरब लोग तो मुजाहरे कर रहे हैं, कल भी बगदाद में मुजाहरा हुआ है, जॉर्डन के बॉर्डर पे, लिबनान के बॉर्डर पे, पूरी अरब वर्ल्ड में इस टाइम शदीद गुस्सा है। अरब अवाम इसराइल के साथ ताल्लुकात नहीं चाहते, इसी तरह पाकिस्तान के अवाम इसराइल के साथ ताल्लुकात नहीं चाहते। ये ताल्लुकात या फौज चाहती है या आपके कुछ हुक्मरान चाहते होंगे, पाकिस्तान के अवाम नहीं चाहते। आखिर में थोड़ी सी मैं बात करना चाहता हूँ, एक गंदा किस्म का, क्रूड किस्म का प्रोपेगेंडा शुरू किया गया है पिछले 2 हफ्ते से कुछ नाम निहाद लिबरल्स की तरफ से, जो इसराइल की हमायत कर रहे हैं और लेफ्ट का मजाक उड़ा रहे हैं कि जी ये तो हमास के साथ खड़े हैं। ये जो हमें ये ताना दे रहे हैं कि हम हमास के साथ खड़े हैं, मैं उनको याद दिलाना चाहता हूं कि हम हमास के साथ नहीं खड़े हैं, तुम लोग ज़ियाउल हक के साथ खड़े हो। ज़ियाउल हक वो आदमी था जिसको ब्लैक सितंबर का आर्किटेक्ट बोला जाता है, आज तक अरबों को नहीं भूला, और तुम लोग ज़ियाउल हक के साथ खड़े हो, बायां बाजू मौलवी और हमास के साथ नहीं खड़ा। और हमारे 100 इख्तलाफात है हमास के साथ, लेकिन इस पे तौफीक ज्यादा बेहतर बात करेंगे। उनसे सवाल भी पूछा गया कि बाएं बाजू का क्या मौक़िफ़ है हमास के ऊपर। हम मौलवियों के साथ नहीं खड़े हैं, हम अपने नजरियात के साथ खड़े हैं। मौलवी एंटी वो यहूदियों के खिलाफ है, हम सहूनियत के खिलाफ हैं। वो मजहब की बुनियाद पे सियासत करते हैं, हम इंटरनेशनलिज्म की बुनियाद पे सियासत करते हैं। और एक जो और 2 नुक्ते सिर्फ मुख्तसर से और मैं उठाना चाहता हूँ। एक, हमें बताया जा रहा है कि जी देखिए इसराइल तो जमहूरी रियासत है, वाहिद जमहूरी रियासत है। मसले की बात यह है कि ये क्रूड प्रोपेगेंडा अब इसराइल में भी इस पे कोई यकीन नहीं करता। जो ये लिबरल हमें सुना रहे हैं पाकिस्तान में, इसराइल एक अपार्थाइड स्टेट है, और अगर आपको जमहूरियत की बुनियादी डेफिनेशन आती हो, बुनियादी तारीफ मालूम हो, तो अपार्थाइड और जमहूरियत एक साथ नहीं चल सकते। एक और बात हमें बताई जा रही है कि अगर इसराइल इतना ही जालिम होता, वो इतनी बड़ी मिलिट्री पावर है, तो वो बाकी अरब मुल्कों पर क्यों कब्जा नहीं कर लेता? भाई सीधी सी बात है, इसराइल एक सिहूनी रियासत है। अगर वो एक्सपैंड करेंगे, अगर वो लिबनान को, शाम को या मिस्र को या उर्दन को फतह करने की कोशिश करेंगे, तो वो अपने ही मुल्क में जो वो मकबूजा मुल्क वो बनाएंगे उसमें एक माइनॉरिटी बन जाएंगे। इसलिए वो सेटलमेंट्स करते हैं, इसलिए वो इंटरनल कॉलोनियलिज्म करते हैं। तो किस्सा मुख्तसर, बतौर लेफ्ट हम पूरी तरह फलस्तीन के साथ खड़े हैं। हम इंटरनेशनलिज्म की बुनियाद पर और इस बुनियाद पर खड़े हैं, ये आखिरी मेजर कॉलोनियल प्रोजेक्ट बचा है इस दुनिया में, और कॉलोनियलिज्म के खिलाफ बाएं बाजू की एक पूरी दुनिया में काबिल फख्र जदोजहद है। ये हमारी उसी जदोजहद का हिस्सा है, और हम ये समझते हैं जस्टिस एनीवेयर, इनजस्टिस एनीवेयर इज इनजस्टिस एवरीवेयर। इस बुनियाद पर हम ना सिर्फ इसराइल बल्कि जहां भी इनजस्टिस होगा उसके खिलाफ खड़े होंगे। चाहे आज हम कमजोर हैं, लेकिन जितने भी हैं हम इस जुल्म के खिलाफ खड़े हैं यूनाइटेड होकर पाकिस्तान में, और खड़े रहेंगे। बहुत शुक्रिया।
Thank you very much, Farooq Sulehria, for effectively articulating the position of left on Palestine, and also sort of resisting the ongoing extremely problematic narrative coming from the liberal quarters. This is very much, I mean, we are moving towards the end of the conversation, but we have a few questions. One of the participants, Rafiq Arniji, asked a question, which is something I wanted to speak about as well. And I would like Tariq Ali to comment on the difference between Zionism and anti-Semitism. That's something extremely blurred by the mainstream media, which Tariq spoke about earlier as well. But would you like to shed some light on it? You need to unmute yourself.
To describe Zionism and the roots of anti-Semitism is a long subject. A lot has been written about it. This never used to be the case of insisting that all Jews are Zionists. That is what lies behind it. And prior to the Second World War, the Jewish communities globally were totally divided between Zionists and anti-Zionists, and the religious Jews, many of whom, as we see today even, don't support Zionism. It could be argued that in many of the diaspora communities, the non-Zionists or anti-Zionists were much, much stronger. What brought that process to an end was the Holocaust, the Judeocide, where they fell silent because of the horrors of what had happened. That is effectively what the Zionists exploited, though some of their leaders made quite horrific remarks about the Jews who died in the extermination camps. So the process that has been taking place is a process of saying that the only good Jew is a Zionist Jew. All the others are bad Jews. This is a tradition that goes way back to the beginnings of the last century, where even Winston Churchill said the same thing: the Zionist Jews, the good Jews, deserve a country of their own. And he said, I hate the left-wing Jews, the Bolshevik Jews, the Jewish Bolshevik attempt to create revolutions everywhere. So conservative politicians backed this aim up, and today it's accepted, not by everyone, but it's sort of become the common sense of the mainstream media. And in Britain, there have been commissions which have passed laws saying criticism of Israel is not on because it's anti-Semitic. This was the purpose of the latest round of denouncing Jeremy Corbyn and other left-wing members of the Labour Party as anti-Semites. The aim of this operation was to stop all criticism of Israel and say that you people have no right to criticize Israel because you're anti-Semitic. But these arguments totally collapse when Israeli atrocities basically are so blatant that they can't be denied. And on yesterday's march in London, I didn't see a single Zionist banner saying you are anti-Semites. Not a single one. So, and 4 generations marched yesterday of Palestinians, of non-Palestinians, many cases of anti-Zionist Jews to show their support for Palestine. So I think it's a thing they try on, but it can't collapse. I mean, the historic roots of anti-Semitism lie in Christianity and the early clashes between Christians and Jews, starting with we don't know whether this is a fact, but according to Christian tradition, the Jewish killings of Jesus and his faction, who were a break and a split off from traditional Judaism. So we can discuss this till kingdom come, but the basic function of it today is to say, if you criticize Israel, you're an anti-Semite. And the result is that young people now, from everywhere, don't care if that's what you call us. And what these people don't realize is what creates a sort of casual and unacceptable, but a casual anti-Semitism is the way Israel has been behaving. To say that, say, oh, you can't say that. Why can't we say that? It's a fact that from the Six-Day War onwards, people say, well, this is what they do. And now it's sort of, so they are themselves helping to fan the flames of anti-Semitism while saying that the people whose fault it is are the international left and Labour Party, etc.
Thank you so much, Tariq. And I know time is short, so I'm going to lump together several questions into one final question. First, drawing on the question raised by Salman for Toufic, which is asking about the different sophisticated mechanisms used during the Arab Spring and beyond to control Palestinians, and how, and extending this question to Dana as well, because a lot of those mechanisms, of course, we know we've been discussing, go beyond Israel to the funders, to the United States, to these Western policies as well. How people on the ground are actually overcoming these neutralizing policies. And in some cases, are we, does this moment point to a third intifada where different strategies are being used by people to overcome those neutralizing policies and those the sophisticated mechanisms of controlling Palestinian people? So to Dana and then Toufic, please.
Yeah, thanks. So I think, as has, I think, been alluded to in this discussion kind of tangentially a couple of times, is that Jerusalem plays a specific role given its specific situation, given the Palestinians in Jerusalem and their unique relationship to the Israeli occupation. But they're, you know, admittedly, they also have a lot to overcome. You know, unlike people in the West Bank, where they have these like multiple levels of like geographic fragmentation and inability to move around and connect with each other because of these geographic boundaries. And as I mentioned, some of the political fragmentation, Jerusalemites have more freedom of movement, but the Israeli occupation has been very targeted and adamant about destroying Palestinian institutions in the city. They, you know, the many ways in which people can build an organizing capacity, get to know each other, build personal trust, build a movement, build strategies. A lot of these organizations that used to serve Palestinians in this way no longer do. For a while, what we saw was, in the face of aggression, whether it was Mohammed Abu Khader's murder or the 2017 Al-Aqsa restrictions that caused also a swelling of protests and support and resistance against those restrictions. What we saw was these movements could emerge using very organic strategies and like word of mouth and like personal connections and like these small, you know, people's social circles. But they were successful. They garnered concessions from the Israeli occupation, but they were short term. They were part of the reason they were successful is because they were limited in scope, let's say, because they were asking for something specific. But they didn't address the overall trends of what is happening. But what those movements, what those moments have been kind of cumulative. People have built relationships with each other over time and have been able to challenge some of these restrictions that they face in spite of the very heavy-handed repression. Today we saw an arrest campaign in Jerusalem at dawn. I don't know how many, tens of people have been arrested since this morning, many of them minors. So there is very heavy-handed repression. There's every attempt made to make sure that people don't protest and don't coordinate. But these moments show Palestinians, what they're capable of. This moment in particular added something very interesting, which is a level of coordination with Palestinian activists within the Green Line, which they have had, of course, solidarity protests in the past, but nothing compared to what we have now, where there's like active coordination. A third element is this as we mentioned, this younger generation very effectively using social media and like their kind of pulpits to galvanize Palestinians, galvanize their own communities to come and support them, but also change the narrative, you know, at an international level. So I don't know that this is going to be a third intifada. What we're seeing are protests across historic Palestine, protests even within the Green Line. And that is a very interesting dynamic and should be followed. But I don't want to demoralize people because there's also a lot of repression, and Palestinians within the Green Line are a minority and they're heavily repressed, and they're being attacked not only by the state but by Israeli mobs. The Israeli society is up in arms against them. It's not just official police sources, though of course these lines can very quickly blur. So I don't want people to say, well, you know, if this doesn't emerge into some long-lasting protest movement, as we saw in the first Intifada, 4 or 5 years worth of protest and resistance, for people to become demoralized. These are cumulative processes, and the connections people made this time around, if they don't serve to maintain the resistance for a long period of time now, can be used in the future. So yeah, hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah. Thank you, Dana. So we have gone past the time already. Very quickly to Toufic to answer the question that Tabby raised earlier, and just to sort of rephrase part of it. People are interested in knowing more about the resistance movement on the ground. How is it different from the earlier movements? How progressive it is, and how detached you think it is from the larger political entities, say Hamas and Al-Fatah?
It's a good question. I think, I mean, certainly we have a mass outpouring of popular struggle taking place across all of historical Palestine right now. You know, certainly that's very evident in Jerusalem. And yesterday we saw 11 people killed in the West Bank in over 200 different localities where there were demonstrations. So the West Bank is about to, is kicking off, so to speak. Gaza, it goes without saying that we know what's happening there. And 48, clearly there's outpouring. I'm not of the mind that of this duality that tends to come out in the discourse sometimes, that's like there's the factions and then there's the people. Like they're not there tends to be sometimes too much blame for or critique of the factions as though they don't. I mean, for instance, we say there's popular struggle, but I'll be frank, you will find factional people inside as part of the struggle inside Jerusalem. You know, I mean, it's not, but that they're not leading it. There is a crisis of Palestinian popular institutions, and so the factions actually being able to take on the diversity of complex challenges that they have to do. It's very difficult. Their members are arrested if they raise their head. Across the West Bank, in Gaza, they're, you know, they have actually more room for maneuver, but now the struggle is so militarized, it's quite underground, to be frank. And of course, the militarization of the struggle also has this dynamic of taking away from the ability for, you know, it turns struggle into a kind of elite project because, you know, you're fighting with a gun or whatever, but it doesn't leave much space for people on the ground to be doing things in Gaza, other than mobilizing around the military struggle. I mean, because of the fragmented nature of the geography and the politics of the way Israel has treated, it's very difficult to have one common tactic or set of strategies against Israel. And that makes it very complicated, because when Westerners or outsiders see what's going on here, they're like, okay, so why don't you just keep it peaceful? Or why are you throwing rockets? Or, okay, we support you, but kind of thing. And of course, that plays into the hands of the Israelis, who play on the question of, oh, these are just Islamists or anti-Semites, or, you know, and it goes down that route. So the best thing that we can do, I think, is just to simply educate ourselves about how Israel, you know, has been adamant to try and fragment the Palestinians historically, and created this situation of this fragmented situation on the ground. But ultimately, the unifying factor is Zionism, is Jewish supremacy, and its connections to the Western elites and the role that Israel plays for the West here, and for Arab governments as well. I mean, Israel now, especially under Trump, basically became this entity that was subcontracted by the West to play the big brother role more and more for the Arab regimes. And that's why we saw the Abraham Accords. Basically, America wanted to make sure that the Arab dictatorships could openly and effectively do as much as they could with Israel to take advantage of, to create a sort of strategic political alliance across the region, because obviously they feared Arab democracy and democracy across the MENA region after the 2011 uprisings taking place. And I would argue now also that the Palestinian struggle is going to reignite those fires, after several waves of counter-revolution across the region, which saw a lot of setbacks. But the fundamental conditions which led to the Arab uprisings across the region still remain in place. These revolutions have not achieved what they were looking for in terms of bread and dignity and justice and everything. And certainly the Palestinians haven't. And the Palestinians tend to become this political issue that captures the different dimensions of, in this case, direct coloniality, but also that captures the sentiment of neo-coloniality that many other Arabs feel in their disenfranchisement across the region because of whatnot. So for that reason, I think we should prepare for long-term struggle. I think whether it's intifada or not, we call it, it's not relevant. What we can be sure of is Israel is not changing its stripes anytime soon. We're witnessing the Europeans doubling down with their just, ridiculous things like banning demonstrations in Paris for Palestine demonstrations. We're seeing the raising of the Israeli flags in Germany. I did a press interview the other day where basically the lead story after 130 Palestinians are killed in Gaza was about the anti-Semitism of Palestinians for Euronews the other day. It was shocking. They're doubling down on this thing. And that's why actually what Tariq was talking about, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, is very actually important. We have to come back and rebut that very quickly and very strong and say, actually, Human Rights Watch calls this place apartheid. It's not a question anymore. That basically means it's Jewish supremacy. So actually resistance to Jewish supremacy is actually required. That's not, that doesn't mean we have any apologias for any acts of potential anti-Semitism, or that those kinds of things can't exist within our movement. But the majority of resistance and the resistance against Jewish supremacy is a moral right and a necessary set of actions that we need to take place, because actually we're witnessing the last colonial struggle in the world, or the major colonial struggle in the world. Of course, many areas have different elements of coloniality, but this is settler colonialism that's left over from the old European powers here. And it's incontrovertible, the apartheid, military, fascistic nature and direction of where this thing is sliding into. And so we need to build accordingly in the long term for that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Excellent, Toufic. A huge honor to be part of the session. Thank you to all the speakers for educating us. Towards the end, I saw some of the participants asking about the future movement. How can people from different parts of the world support the cause? I'll only rephrase, but what Palestinian activists like Muhammad al-Kurd have been saying on social media for quite a few days, that donations and aid won't help the Palestinian cause. What you really need to do is to hold protests, organize rallies, take part in the BDS movement, pressure your governments to pressure the Israeli forces and end this colonial project once and for all. More and more power to everyone out there who is supporting the Palestinian cause. I thank again all the speakers for making their time for this really enlightening and insightful discussion. Thank you from Bilal, and of course from Tabi, and from everyone at Haqooq-e-Khalq Movement here in Pakistan. More and more power to you. Goodbye.